Grace Kelly had everything a woman could desire: an Oscar, a fortune, and a crown. But the wedding of the century was never a fairy tale. It was a ruthless business merger. To the world, she was a princess, but to the bankrupt state of Monaco, she was a human asset acquired to save the economy. She didn't simply walk away from Hollywood. The expectations of her new role effectively ended her film career. The price for her title was a staggering dowry, reported at around $2 million, and an expectation that her acting career would end. Grace Kelly was not a Cinderella, finding her happy ending. She was a cinematic icon locked in a golden cage, serving as a living decoration for a kingdom that needed her fame more than her love. But the conditioning for this life of high-stakes performance began long before she set foot in a palace. It began in Philadelphia, under the crushing shadow of the man who first built her up, only to systematically break her down: her father, John B. Jack Kelly. In the mythology of the American dream, Jack Kelly was a titan, a self-made millionaire who rose from the grit of manual labor to build a construction empire. He was an Olympic gold medalist in rowing, a man who worshipped physical strength, dominance, and the tangible victory of sweat and stone. In the Kelly household, affection was not a birthright, it was a trophy to be won. And in this arena of gladiatorial parenting, Grace was born to lose. She was the antithesis of everything Jack Kelly valued. While her siblings were athletic, boisterous, and robust, Grace was the runt of the litter. She was sickly, wheezing with asthma, peering at the world through thick glasses, possessing a fragile, ethereal quality that her father viewed with undisguised contempt. He didn't hide his disappointment. He broadcast it. He openly favored her sister Peggy, the athlete, the joker, the Kelly he understood. Grace was an alien in her own home, a delicate instrument trying to survive in a house built for hammers. This rejection was the foundational trauma of her life. It carved a hollow space in her chest that no amount of applause could ever fill. It was the engine of a desperate, lifelong campaign to force her father to look at her, really look at her, with something other than pity. It was this hunger for validation that drove her out of Philadelphia and into the arms of the theater. If she couldn't win on the river, she would win on the stage. She fled to New York, enrolling in the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, driven by a steely, almost terrifying discipline. She wasn't just acting, she was constructing a persona, layering sophistication over her insecurities like armor. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, she was an anomaly. The industry was dominated by the bombshell sexuality of Marilyn Monroe and the earthy intensity of the method actors. Grace was different. She was ice. She was the snow princess, projecting a patrician elegance that suggested she was above the grime of the studio system. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of psychological manipulation, saw the turbulence beneath the surface. He famously called her a snow-covered volcano, recognizing that her cool exterior was a lid on a boiling pot of repressed passion and ambition. He exploited this duality to perfection, casting her in Rear Window, Dial M for Murder, and To Catch a Thief. In just 5 years, a blink of an eye in Hollywood time, Grace Kelly conquered the summit. She became one of Hollywood's most in-demand and highly paid stars, a fashion icon and a darling of the critics. In 1955, at the age of 25, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Country Girl. It was the ultimate validation, the highest honor her profession could bestow. She stood on the stage, the golden statue in her hand, the world at her feet, and waited for the one reaction that mattered. But when reporters called Jack Kelly to ask for his comment on his daughter's triumph, he didn't offer pride. He offered a humiliation so public and so casual, it takes the breath away. "I'm simply shocked," he told the press. "I thought it would be Peggy. Anything Grace could do, Peggy could always do better." It was a devastating psychological blow. At the absolute peak of her career, holding the most coveted prize in cinema, she was still just the runt to her father. The Oscar was meaningless. The fame was noise. Grace realized with a chilling clarity that being a movie star would never be enough for the Philadelphia establishment or for her father. In their eyes, actors were still carnival folk, transient, and slightly disreputable. To win the game, she didn't need another movie. She needed a status Hollywood could never grant, a title that no one back home could dismiss. At the exact same moment that Grace Kelly was realizing the limitations of her stardom, a crisis was unfolding 3,000 miles away on the coast of the Mediterranean. The Principality of Monaco was dying. It was not the playground of billionaires we know today. By the mid-1950s, it was a dusty, forgotten relic of the Victorian era. The casinos were empty, the hotels were crumbling, and the treasury was dangerously close to zero. Prince Rainier III, the chain-smoking, brooding monarch, was facing an existential threat. The French government was losing patience with Monaco's tax haven status and was applying intense pressure that put the principality's autonomy at risk. He didn't need a wife in the romantic sense. He needed a tactical nuclear weapon of public relations. His advisors, including the shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis, gave him a cold-blooded prescription: marry a Hollywood star. Onassis looked at the balance sheets and saw that the only way to bring the American tourists and their dollars back to the Riviera was to turn the principality into a stage set. They needed a global celebrity to play the role of princess. They needed a face that could launch 1,000 yachts. It was a casting call for the savior of a nation. The initial suggestion was Marilyn Monroe, but the advisors balked. She was too volatile, too scandalous for the Catholic rigidity of the Grimaldi court. They needed someone regal. They needed someone with an impeccable reputation, a Catholic background, and the kind of icy poise that could withstand the scrutiny of the world. They looked at the box office receipts, they looked at the magazine covers, and the target was acquired. They found Grace Kelly. Thus, the stage was set for the collision of two desperate entities. On one side, a woman seeking the ultimate validation to heal the wounds of her childhood. On the other, a prince seeking a financial lifeline to save his kingdom. They were about to enter into a contract that the world would call a fairy tale, but which history would reveal to be a gilded trap. The meeting was arranged, the photographers were summoned, and the machinery of the merger began to turn. Grace Kelly was about to step into the role of a lifetime, unaware that the script had already been written, and it did not have a happy ending. The meeting that changed the course of history was not written in the stars. It was scheduled by the marketing department of a French magazine. In May 1955, Grace Kelly was on the French Riviera for the Cannes Film Festival, promoting The Country Girl. The editors of Paris Match, sensing a major media moment, orchestrated a meet and greet between the American movie queen and the bachelor Prince of Monaco. It was a stunt, a photo opportunity designed to sell glossy pages, but for Prince Rainier, it was a job interview. The reality of that day was far removed from the romanticized retelling. It was a logistical nightmare. A strike by the electrical union at Grace's hotel meant she couldn't use a hairdryer or iron her clothes. She arrived at the palace wearing a wrinkled floral dress made of synthetic taffeta, one of the few things that didn't need pressing. Her hair pulled back hastily to hide the fact it was unwashed. When she arrived, Rainier was late. She was left cooling her heels in the palace antechambers, touring the dusty, empty rooms of a kingdom that felt more like a museum than a home. When the prince finally appeared, He was charming, yes, but he was also assessing. He wasn't looking for a soulmate. He was inspecting a potential asset. He walked her through the gardens, they shook hands for the cameras, and the shutter clicked. That image of the shy prince and the radiant star was the first draft of the marketing campaign that would save Monaco. What followed was a courtship conducted with the speed and efficiency of a corporate acquisition. They exchanged letters, but behind the polite correspondence, the machinery of the state was turning. Rainier needed to close the deal before the next fiscal year. By Christmas of 1955, the prince traveled to Philadelphia to meet the Kelly clan. The press painted it as a romantic pilgrimage, a prince coming to claim his love. In reality, it was a boardroom negotiation held in the brick mansion of Jack Kelly. It was here, over brandy and cigars, that the fairy tale dissolved into a transaction. The House of Grimaldi, despite its titles and history, was cash poor. The infrastructure of Monaco was crumbling, and the prince's advisors had made a cold calculation. The bride had to bring capital. They presented the Kelly family with a demand for a dowry. Later accounts and biographies often place it at around $2 million. In today's money, that is a fortune. In 1956, it was an astronomical sum. For a moment, the deal nearly collapsed. Jack Kelly, the self-made bricklayer who had fought for every dime, was incensed. He reportedly barked, "My daughter doesn't have to pay any man to marry her." It was an insult to his pride, a reversal of the American dynamic where the man proves his worth to the father. But the ambition to social climb was stronger than the sting of the insult. The Kellys wanted the title. They wanted the legitimacy that only a European bloodline could provide. A compromise was struck, one that is rarely discussed in the glossy biographies because of its profound sadness. Jack Kelly agreed to pay half, $1 million. The other million? It had to come from Grace. This is the pivotal, heartbreaking detail of the merger. Grace Kelly, the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion on movie sets, who had saved her earnings while living in a modest apartment in New York, had to empty her own bank accounts to buy her way into this marriage. She was essentially paying a $2 million entrance fee to a golden cage. She was purchasing her own shackles, but the financial cost was merely the down payment. The true price was extracted in the fine print of the marriage contract. During the negotiations, a question was raised about her career. Grace, naive to the rigid protocols of the old world, assumed she could continue to act. She was, after all, an artist. Acting was not just what she did, it was who she was. Rainier and his advisors quickly corrected this misunderstanding. A princess of Monaco could not be seen romancing other men on screen. She could not be subject to the direction of others. She could not be a commercial entity. The expectation was clear. Once she became Her Serene Highness, her life as a working actress was no longer compatible with the role. She was 26 years old. She was at the absolute zenith of her powers. And she agreed to retire. It was a cultural suicide. Imagine Picasso agreeing to never paint again in exchange for a castle. Imagine Mozart agreeing to silence for a title. Grace signed the papers, effectively liquidating her artistic soul to satisfy the diplomatic requirements of a microstate. She convinced herself it was a noble sacrifice for love and family, the script of a martyr she was now obliged to play. On April 4, 1956, Grace Kelly boarded the SS Constitution in New York Harbor. Thousands of fans lined the docks, cheering, waving handkerchiefs, weeping for the loss of their American queen. To the public, it looked like a triumphal departure. To Grace, standing on the deck waving with that practiced stiff arm, it must have felt like being exported. She was bringing her dogs, her furniture, and her bridesmaids, leaving behind the freedom of anonymity and the thrill of the set. The voyage took 8 days, 8 days to say goodbye to the woman she had been. When the ship docked in Monaco, the chaos was biblical. Aristotle Onassis tried to drop carnations from a seaplane, but the wind blew them into the sea. The streets were choked with tourists. The paparazzi swarmed like locusts. This was the wedding of the century, but it was produced by MGM. The studio, in a final act of ownership, was broadcasting the wedding as a documentary. They had technicians, lights, and cameras rigging the cathedral. Grace was contractually obligated to perform this last role for them. The ceremony itself, held on April 19, 1956, was less a religious sacrament and more a televised pageant. 3 distinct ceremonies were required: a civil ceremony, a church mass, and a reception. Grace was encased in a dress of antique Brussels lace and silk taffeta, a masterpiece of costume design that was heavy, hot, and restricting. As she knelt at the altar of the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, millions of viewers across the globe watched her face. They saw serenity. They saw the Ice Princess. But look closer at the footage. You do not see joy. You see terror masked by discipline. You see a woman who is exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely dissociated from the event. Rainier, seemingly terrified by the scale of the circus he had invited into his home, looked grim and sweaty. He fumbled with the ring. The priest droned on. The heat under the television lights was suffocating. At one point, Grace looked up at the ceiling, taking a deep breath, and later admitted she was just trying not to faint. This wasn't a wedding. It was a coronation, a transfer of power, and a branding launch event, all rolled into one. As the couple drove away in the Rolls-Royce, waving to the screaming crowds, the deal was officially done. The dowry was paid. The contract was signed. The career was finished. The tourists were already booking hotels for the next season. The Principality of Monaco was saved. But as the heavy gates of the Prince's Palace swung shut behind the Rolls-Royce, locking out the world, the reality set in for the new princess. The cameras were turned off. The directors went home. The script was finished. For the first time in her life, Grace Kelly was on a stage with no exit signs, playing a character she hadn't auditioned for, with a leading man she barely knew. The fairy tale was over. The confinement had begun. When the last of the confetti was swept from the streets of Monte Carlo and the armada of yachts sailed away, a profound silence descended upon the rock of Monaco. The wedding of the century was over. The credits had rolled. And for Grace Kelly, the reality of the sequel began. It was not a happily ever after. It was a jarring, disorienting cut to black. The woman who had lived her life in the kinetic, collaborative, and deeply modern world of American cinema now woke up in a medieval fortress that operated on the social calendar of the 19th century. The Prince's Palace of Monaco was not the airy, sun-drenched villa of To Catch a Thief. It was a museum. It was a drafty, 200-room mausoleum of history, guarded by the ghosts of the Grimaldi ancestors and a staff of servants who viewed their new American mistress with suspicion. Grace, who was used to the camaraderie of a film crew, the jokes, the shared coffees, the late-night rehearsals, found herself isolated in a world of rigid protocol. There were rules for everything, rules for how to enter a room, rules for when to sit, rules for what to wear. She wasn't the lady of the house. She was the newest exhibit in a collection. The culture shock was physical. Monaco in the late 1950s was not a cosmopolitan hub. It was a small, insular, and deeply conservative town. The local aristocracy, the Monegasques, looked down on her. To them, she wasn't royalty. She was an actress, a show person. They whispered about her lack of noble blood, her American accent, her Hollywood past. Grace wrote letters home to her friends in Philadelphia, letters that were cheerful on the surface but bled loneliness between the lines. She described the palace as a prison of gold. She missed the noise of New York. She missed the intellectual stimulation. She missed her friends. But the most crushing realization was the nature of her marriage. Prince Rainier III was a man under siege. The stress of ruling a failing state, the constant threat of French annexation, and the pressure to restore Monaco's glory made him irritable and controlling. The charming suitor who had wooed her in Philadelphia was replaced by a stressed CEO. He had a temper. He was a traditionalist who believed a wife's place was one step behind her husband, silent and supportive. He did not understand her need for creative expression. To him, acting was a job she had quit, not a vocation she had sacrificed. The suppression of Grace Kelly the artist was systematic. One of the first orders of business in the new regime was the erasure of her cinematic past. Some accounts claim her films were discouraged or even kept off local screens in Monaco, though the extent of any ban is disputed. Rainier did not want his subjects to see their princess kissing Cary Grant or James Stewart. It was considered undignified. The very work that had made her a global icon, the talent that had won her an Oscar, was treated like a shameful secret that needed to be buried. Some accounts suggest her films were not welcomed inside palace life, though the specifics vary depending on the source. The message was clear. Grace Kelly is dead. Long live Princess Grace. She threw herself into the only role allowed to her, the mother. In rapid succession, she produced the heirs the contract demanded. Princess Caroline was born in 1957, followed by Prince Albert in 1958. She secured the succession. She fulfilled the merger agreement. Monaco was safe from France. But as she pushed the pram through the palace gardens, the paparazzi lenses zooming in from the cliffs above, a deep melancholy began to settle in her eyes. She was bored, a boredom so profound it felt like physical pain. She was a racehorse locked in a petting zoo. Then, in 1962, 6 years into her confinement, a lifeline appeared. It came in the form of a script from the only man who truly understood her, Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock had never accepted Grace's retirement. He saw it as a waste of a rare genius. He sent her the screenplay for his new film, Marnie. It was a dark, complex psychological thriller about a kleptomaniac, a sexually repressed woman with a traumatic past. It was a role that required immense range, exactly the kind of challenge Grace craved. It was a chance to be an artist again. Grace read the script. Her heart raced. For the first time in years, she felt the old spark. She showed it to Rainier. Surprisingly, perhaps feeling guilty about her obvious unhappiness, he tentatively agreed. They announced to the world that Princess Grace would be returning to Hollywood to star in Marnie. The news hit the world like a thunderclap. The press went wild. Grace was ecstatic. She began planning her wardrobe, discussing the character with Hitchcock. She was going to escape the cage. She was going to have a summer of freedom. But she had underestimated the bars of her prison. The reaction in Monaco was catastrophic. The conservative citizens were horrified. Their princess playing a thief, a woman with issues? It was a scandal. Some reports later claimed the Vatican expressed discomfort with the idea, though the specifics are difficult to verify. But the final nail in the coffin came from Charles de Gaulle, the president of France. At that precise moment, France and Monaco were locked in a tense diplomatic standoff over tax laws. De Gaulle was threatening to cut off electricity and water to the principality. For the Princess of Monaco to run off to Hollywood to make a vulgar movie at such a critical time was seen as a dereliction of duty. It was political suicide. Rainier, facing pressure from his subjects and the terrifying wrath of France, withdrew his support. He told Grace it was impossible. The door that had cracked open was slammed shut, locked, and bolted. Grace was forced to issue a humiliating public retraction. She claimed that scheduling conflicts and her duties as a mother prevented her from taking the role. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Hitchcock was heartbroken. He eventually cast Tippi Hedren, but he famously said that Marnie was the role Grace was born to play. For Grace, the loss of Marnie was the death knell. It was the moment she realized there was no escape. There would be no sabbatical. There would be no third act. She fell into a deep depression. Friends who visited her during this period described a woman who had simply turned off. She gained weight. She stopped reading scripts. She began to suffer from severe migraines. The Ice Princess had frozen over completely. She realized that she wasn't just married to a man, she was married to a state. She was a public utility, like the waterworks or the casino. From 1962 onwards, the transformation was total. She perfected the mask. She became the serene highness the world expected. She cut ribbons at flower shows. She hosted the Red Cross ball. She smiled that practiced porcelain smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She became a master of small talk, a genius of superficiality. But inside, the fire was out. The woman who had fought her way to the top of Hollywood was gone, replaced by a figurehead who existed solely to keep the property values of Monte Carlo high. The merger was a resounding success for the shareholders. Monaco was thriving. The rich were back. The real estate was booming. But the asset at the center of the deal was depreciating rapidly. Grace Kelly was paying the interest on the loan with her soul. And as the 1970s approached, the cracks in the perfect facade would begin to show, leading to a restlessness that would eventually put her on a dangerous road, a winding stretch of asphalt known as the Corniche. By the 1970s, the metamorphosis was complete. The Hollywood star had been fully metabolized by the machinery of the state. To the outside world, Princess Grace was the epitome of matronly perfection, a global symbol of elegance who had aged gracefully into her role as the mother of a dynasty. But those who knew her saw the cracks in the porcelain. The vibrant, ambitious woman who had defied her family to conquer cinema was gone. In her place was a woman who was visibly weary, battling weight gain, menopause, and a creeping sense of obsolescence. She was a bird who had forgotten how to fly because the cage was too small. The fairy tale marriage had devolved into a polite, functional partnership. Rainier and Grace lived separate lives under the same roof. The prince was consumed by the endless construction projects and political maneuvering required to keep Monaco sovereign. He grew more crotchety, more insular. Grace, starving for connection, sought solace elsewhere. She spent more time in Paris. She bought an apartment there, a small island of autonomy where she could just be Mrs. Grimaldi, where she could shop without a security detail, eat lunch with friends, and pretend for a few hours that she was free. She tried to fill the creative void with safe, approved hobbies. She took up pressed flower art, creating collages from dried petals. It was a poignant metaphor, taking something once alive and vibrant, flattening it, and preserving it under glass. It was beautiful, but it was dead. She organized poetry readings. She became a patron of the ballet. But these were pale substitutes for the adrenaline of the set, the collaboration of a film crew, the raw emotional release of acting. Hitchcock, in his later years, visited her. They would sit together, two titans of a bygone era, and he would watch her with a sad, knowing look. He saw the waste. Her anxieties began to transfer onto her children. Carolyn, the eldest, was headstrong and intellectual, eager to escape the suffocating protocol of the palace. Albert the heir was shy and burdened by the crushing weight of expectation. But it was Stephanie, the youngest, the wild child, who caused Grace the most sleepless nights. Stephanie was everything Grace had been forced to suppress: rebellious, loud, unmanageable. She refused to fit into the royal mold. She wanted to be a pop singer, a designer, a free spirit. Grace saw her own suppressed rebellion in her daughter, and it terrified her. Their relationship was volatile, a constant tug of war between a mother trying to protect her child from the world and a daughter trying to break free from her mother's shadow. By the summer of 1982, Grace was 52 years old. She was tired. She told friends she felt a sense of foreboding. She spoke of wanting to leave Monaco more permanently, of buying a country house in England far away from the prying eyes of the Mediterranean paparazzi. She was planning a third act, a quiet retirement where she could finally take off the mask. But destiny, scripted with the cruel irony of a Greek tragedy, had one final scene left to play. On the morning of Monday, September 13th, 1982, the sun was blazing over the Côte d'Azur. Grace was at Rocagel, the royal family's country retreat, high in the hills above Monaco. It was a place of refuge, a rustic farmhouse where she could garden and wear pants. She needed to return to the palace in Monaco that day. She and Stephanie were due to leave. The chauffeur brought the car around, a Rover P6 3500, often reported as a 1972 model. It was a sturdy, sensible car, the back seat piled high with dresses and boxes. There wasn't enough room for 3 people. In a decision that has been analyzed for decades, Grace dismissed the chauffeur. "I will drive," she said. The chauffeur hesitated. The road down to Monaco was not a highway. It was the D37, a treacherous, winding snake of asphalt, known as the Moyenne Corniche. It was a road of hairpin turns and sheer drops, unforgiving to even the most skilled drivers. And Grace was not a skilled driver. She hated driving. She had barely driven in years. Why did she insist? Was it a desire for privacy with her daughter? A moment of stubborn independence? We will never know. She got behind the wheel. Stephanie, 17 years old and sullen, climbed into the passenger seat. The Rover pulled out of the driveway and began the descent. 10 minutes later, behind a truck loaded with oil, a driver noticed the Rover in his rearview mirror. The car was erratic. It was weaving. And then, as it approached a notorious hairpin turn, it didn't slow down. It accelerated. The brake lights never flashed. The car smashed through the low stone retaining wall. It launched into the air, a 2-ton projectile of steel and glass, spinning as it fell. It tumbled roughly 30 meters, about 100 feet down the mountainside, crashing through trees and branches until it landed upside down in a garden below. The sound was deafening, a sickening crunch of metal that echoed off the canyon walls. Silence returned to the hills. Smoke began to rise from the wreckage. Rescuers arrived to find a scene of horror. Stephanie, bloodied and in shock, had managed to crawl out of the passenger side. She was screaming, "Mommy! Mommy!" Inside the crushed metal, Grace Kelly lay twisted and unconscious. She was alive, but barely. The face of the century was battered. Her body was broken. She was rushed to the Princess Grace Hospital, the very hospital named in her honor. The doctors fought for hours. Prince Rainier, pale and shaking, rushed to her bedside. Caroline and Albert were summoned. The world held its breath. The news anchors broke into programming. "Princess Grace has been in an accident." For 24 hours, the palace issued vague statements, downplaying the severity, claiming she had broken a few bones. They were trying to control the narrative one last time. But the scans told a different story. Grace had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Whether the stroke caused the crash or the crash caused the stroke was a debate that would rage later. But the outcome was binary. Her brain was dead. The machine was the only thing keeping the icon breathing. On September 14, 1982, Prince Rainier III faced the hardest decision of his life. The doctors told him there was no hope. The lights were on, but the princess was gone. At 10:55 p.m., he gave the order. The ventilators were turned off. Grace Kelly, the girl from Philadelphia who conquered Hollywood and saved a kingdom, took her last breath. She died as she had lived for the last 26 years, surrounded by doctors, managed by protocol, and watched by the world. The news shattered the globe. It felt impossible. Icons aren't supposed to die in car crashes. They are supposed to fade away. The irony was too sharp to ignore. She had died on the very same stretch of road where she had filmed the most famous car chase in cinema history in To Catch a Thief. In the movie, she drove with reckless abandon, a symbol of freedom and danger, scaring Cary Grant with her speed. In reality, she was a middle-aged mother, likely incapacitated by a medical event, losing control of a heavy sedan on a road she knew too well. The fairy tale had ended in twisted metal and shattered glass. But the show, the relentless, demanding show of the state, had to go on. There was a funeral to plan. The funeral of Grace Kelly was a grotesque mirror image of her wedding. It took place in the same space, the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. It was attended by the same cast of characters, the royalty of Europe, the titans of Hollywood, and the eyes of the world via television cameras. But 26 years later, the Technicolor optimism of 1956 had been bleached into a stark, grainy grief. On September 18, 1982, the sun beat down on the rock with a cruel intensity. Inside the cathedral, the air was stifling. Cary Grant was there, his face lined with age and sorrow. James Stewart, the man who had watched her through a lens in Rear Window, wept openly, removing his glasses to wipe away tears that seemed to be for an entire era that had died with her. Nancy Reagan sat in the front row, representing the American political royalty that the Kellys had always aspired to join. Princess Diana, young and new to the game, watched with a somber expression, perhaps sensing the weight of the destiny that awaited women who marry into institutions. But the most devastating image was that of Prince Rainier, the man who had negotiated the marriage, who had demanded the dowry, who had banned her films, was broken. He was no longer the CEO of the state. He was a husband who had lost his anchor. He walked behind the coffin with a hunch in his shoulders that would never leave him. He wept without shame. In that moment, the transaction fell away. What remained was grief and the cost of everything they had built. All that was left was the brutal realization that he had fallen in love with the asset he had acquired, but he had realized it too late to set her free. Rainier never remarried. He spent the remaining 23 years of his life as a ghost in his own palace, obsessively curating her memory, building gardens in her name and seemingly waiting to join her. He had saved his principality, yes, but he had paid for it with the only thing that actually mattered. If we zoom out from the grief of that day and look at the ledger of history, we must ask, was the merger a success? Financially, the answer is a resounding yes. The gamble that Aristotle Onassis and the palace advisors took in 1955 paid off with a return on investment that defies logic. Grace Kelly saved Monaco. She took a dusty, irrelevant gambling town and turned it into the most exclusive zip code on earth. Today, Monaco is a fortress of wealth. The skyline is crowded with high-rises that cost thousands of euros per square foot. The harbor is choked with super yachts owned by oligarchs and billionaires. The brand of Monaco is synonymous with luxury, and that brand was built entirely on the back of Grace Kelly's image. Her face is still on the postcards. Her name is on the streets, the hospital, the library. She is the patron saint of the tax haven. She did exactly what she was hired to do. She delivered the audience. She legitimized the throne. She secured the line of succession. But what was the cost of this success? The cost was Grace Kelly herself. We must stop telling this story as a fairy tale. A fairy tale implies magic. There was no magic here. There was only a woman of immense talent and drive who was boxed into a corner by the patriarchal expectations of her father and the political necessities of a husband. She was the greatest actress of her generation, not because of High Noon or The Country Girl, but because of the performance she gave from 1956 to 1982. She played the role of Her Serene Highness without a script, without a director, and without a break. She smiled when she was bored. She waved when she was lonely. She pretended to be content in a cage because the stability of a nation depended on her contentment. The tragedy of Grace Kelly is not that she died young. The tragedy is that she died slowly. She died the day she boarded the SS Constitution. She died the day she was told she couldn't do Marnie. She died in the 1,000 small compromises she made to keep the peace in a palace that felt like a prison. The car crash was just the physical end to a spiritual erosion that had been happening for decades. In the final analysis, Grace Kelly proved a terrifying truth about the pursuit of the ultimate dream. She had it all. She had the Oscar. She had the prince. She had the castle. And yet, she was profoundly, devastatingly empty. She spent her life trying to escape the judgment of a father who thought she wasn't enough, only to run into the arms of a husband who thought she was too much. She was not Cinderella. Cinderella is a story about a girl who escapes a life of servitude to find freedom. Grace Kelly's story is the inverse. It is the story of a queen who sold her freedom to enter a life of servitude. She was a woman who paid a $2 million ransom to enter a golden room, only to hear the lock click shut behind her. And as we look back at her life, dazzling and tragic, we must recognize that the most expensive thing she ever bought was not the dowry, but the illusion that a crown would make her whole. She lies today in the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, next to the prince who acquired her. The inscription on her tomb does not list her films. It does not mention her Oscar. It reads simply, Uxor Principis, wife of the prince. Even in death, she belongs to the state. The merger is eternal.